start by talking about Marie Neba, pictured here. She was sentenced to 75 years in prison for Medicare fraud. At 56 years old, she was suffering from stage 4 cancer with 3 children at home and a husband who had fled the country to avoid the same sentence. As NBC News reported, Marie had sought compassionate release multiple times, including after the pandemic began. The warden ignored her request, and prosecutors fought her in federal court when she tried to argue that compassionate release allowed for a release of terminally ill people who do not pose threats to the community. Marie Neba died from COVID not long after.
And Marie Neba is not a rare or unique case. Tens of thousands of people are sitting in and dying in federal correctional facilities who do not need to be there. They are elderly people, people serving low-level offense sentences, drug sentences, people who've been locked up often for decades because the United States has some of the harshest sentencing practices on the planet.
There are over 150,000 people in federal prisons, and so many of these people, just like Marie Neba, could be at home right now with their families. So, of course, this brings the question of what can be done to solve this problem and who should do it. That's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about clemency, which is a singular, powerful tool that the architects of the Constitution designed for the President of the United States to use and intended for the President to use vigorously. It's a vital tool because at the time a person is sentenced to prison, there are so many important things that we just can't know that impact whether a person's need to be incarcerated changes. People grow and they change over time. People who suffer from substance use get treatment. People with serious mental illness get treatment. Kids become adults with adult brains and adult maturity.
Most kids become adults with adult brains. I mean, look, when a judge sentences a person to prison for any length of time, they're not aware of the full picture of that person. We literally cannot know everything that is important to know, let alone knowing who that person will be in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. Think about who you were 5 years ago. Are you the same person you were today? I know that I'm not, and I think that's true for most people. So clemency is this amazing tool that the president can use to say a couple of different things. One thing they can say is, this law for which a person was sentenced no longer really seems fair in the current context of our culture. And more often what they can say is, this person here really, really changed and does not need to be incarcerated. And this person is better at home, in their community, with their family, in a job, in their community.
And Emily, sometimes it's not just people that change, and that's not the only change that needs to be taken into consideration. Society changes. I mean, let's talk about the 1990s versus today. 1990s had some of the harshest sentencing laws in the history of not just the country, but of the world, which fueled this unprecedented incarceration crisis and drove the US to be the world's leading jailer. And the whole country's views since then, in many ways, have shifted. So take, for example, marijuana. In recent years, it's been legalized in red states and blue states, meaning that people right now are locked in federal jails and prisons for something that is now legal in many states. And at the federal level, President-elect Joe Biden helped pass a 1994 crime bill, which contributed to this skyrocketing increase in the prison population. But this is something that he now says that he regrets. And so in thinking about that regret and where that comes from, it brings the answer, what can he do? How do we bring folks home, those folks who are in prisons right now, for things like selling marijuana? The answer is the clemency power.
It's great to have an answer. We so rarely have an answer for these solutions. You could say you regret something you did in 94. You and I probably can't fix the thing we did in 94, but Joe Biden can, which is amazing. So there's this one problem though. There's like this little kink in the system that somebody's got to work out. At the same time as the federal prison population ballooned due to these ludicrous sentencing laws that are way out of step with the rest of the world, and that pretty much everyone now agrees were cruel and counterproductive and didn't make anybody safer and ruined millions of lives. Presidents started using the clemency power less. Like up until very recently, presidents were giving people clemency and pardons and letting people out and really utilizing their power to make people freer, to restore freedom. However, as we started throwing more people into prison, presidents started letting them out less. Under President Obama, not even 2,000 people got clemency, and that's over his whole 8 years in office. These are people like Thomas Brown, who was sentenced to life imprisonment in 1989 for a drug offense. Again, life in prison for a drug offense. People like Audra Cooks, who was nearly 50 years old when he was released from a 20-year sentence for selling, get this, just a little over an ounce of a controlled substance. That was in 2004. People like Norman O'Neill Brown. Norman had let's just be very clear. Norman had a friend whose car was found with drugs in it. Not Norman's car, his friend's car. The FBI taped Norman, telling his friend to tell the police that the car had been stolen, the drugs weren't his. Norman was given a sentence of life in prison. So Obama, to his credit, commuted those sentences. But these cases are not unique. There are literally like thousands of Normans and Audras sitting right now, filing petitions, begging for relief, and not being heard.
You're right. Obama could have done so much more. I mean, he commuted just 5% of the requests that he received. I mean, that's more than George W. Bush, but no better than George H.W. Bush, and worse than every other prior president. So for context, let's talk about Harry Truman. President Harry Truman granted 41% of the petitions he received. If Obama had granted petitions at that same rate, he would have released 15,000 people.
Which is still a drop in the bucket. Like on the scale of mass incarceration, 15,000 people is still very small. So you have to imagine how much infinitesimally smaller Obama's actual releases were.
Right, we're not even close to that number. And even the then Inspector General of the U.S. Department of Justice, which is not a particularly friendly institution for people in prison, said that the Obama administration, quote, did not effectively plan, implement, or manage the clemency process. And this had real damaging effects on people's lives. So let's talk about some of the people who President Obama left behind. So people like Marie Neva, who died because of a case about healthcare. People like Robert Michael Jordan, who was sentenced to 20 years in prison for having a little over an ounce of crack. People like David Barron, sentenced to life in prison, plus 20 years for selling some cocaine. And David is a divorced single father who had been trying to raise 4 kids on his own. And in 2017, Obama commuted only part of his sentence to 30 years. And so even with that commutation, David still has about 15 years left on his sentence. He right now, as we speak, is still sitting in prison while his family still needs him.
You know, it's funny hearing about those cases used to be painful, and now as a parent it's just like 400 times more painful to think about. You know, you have to multiply that impact on David times 4 for his kids, and that's, you have to multiply the impact on every person we're talking about here today times whatever number of kids and loved ones they have in the community who are missing them and needing them.
It's like we talked about this a few segments ago. It's when you incarcerate one person, you're in effect giving a sentence to everybody else in their family and the community that they're a part of, because incarceration affects everybody and it has devastating
Everybody
impacts.
does the time with their loved one. Everybody does every day of that time together. So unsurprisingly and appallingly, Donald Trump has done far worse than any other president in so many ways. Evergreen statement, but we're talking about clemency today. So Trump has granted, and by the way, I want to take a step back. This is especially irritating because Donald Trump likes to put himself forward as like this great ally of people seeking clemency and this great criminal legal reformer. And here's the thing, let's look at the numbers. Donald Trump has granted 44 clemency petitions. How many is that out of? How many requests did he get? How many did he reject? Well, he granted 44 out of over 10,000 requests. So we were just complaining about the slow pace of the Obama administration on this. Like, that doesn't even compare to 44 out of 10,000. This is an abject failure on clemency. The Trump administration did nothing to fix this incredibly dysfunctional process, which we're going to get into. Partly it's the inaction of the president, and partly it's the willingness to kind of just like relax into a totally dysfunctional process that is gumming up the whole system. Alana, let's talk about that process and what Joe Biden can do.
Yes, let's talk some solutions. So Joe Biden needs to, at a minimum, restore the frequency of clemency grants that define the approach that President Trump took and that the drafters of the Constitution envisioned. This means that Biden will need to commute thousands of sentences each year, which is easy to do, by the way, given that tens of thousands of requests come every year, because it's the last hope for so many people who are desperate, sick, dying, and especially right now during a pandemic.
Yeah, or people who just have changed, who have spent years in prison demonstrating that they are different now than they were years ago. But this is not just a will problem. Like, the pipeline of cases is there. The petitions are there. The meritorious people are very much there. But there's this process. Like with all things, there's a bureaucracy. Here's the problem with the process. So right now, who's in charge of deciding which petitions for clemency get attention, which get heard? Is it the president? No. It's the Department of Justice. So, again, under President Obama, 2,000 people got through this process over 8 long years. He had promised many thousands more. Why is it a problem that the Department of Justice is the gatekeeper here? Well, who's at the Department of Justice? It's a whole bunch of prosecutors. Yes, there's a civil rights division, but generally what we're talking about here is a bunch of prosecutors looking at these clemency petitions and deciding whether these human beings deserve another chance at freedom. So clemency was designed to be something that comes from the president, that comes from a human understanding imbued by the US Constitution of who these people are and what their lives are worth and who they have become and what's at stake and what the risks are, right? The US Constitution said the president, as a president and as a human being and as a leader, should make these choices and set people free. But President Obama and now President Trump didn't, I guess, want that responsibility. I don't want to suppose their intentions, but for whatever reason, they let DOJ just kind of take over the responsibility, the weight of these human decisions. And that meant that they let bureaucracy and petty infighting and internal politics just slow down the process of second chances to an absolutely glacial pace.
And Joe Biden has a real obligation, particularly given his history, to fix this process by owning it. From day one, he's got to bring this process back into the White House, because doing so would expedite review of petitions and the delivery of commutations. And this is a real chance for Joe Biden to start from scratch and build an efficient system that ensures that every single person has a fair chance at a second chance.
Alana, before you go on, I know you're about to delve into this idea a little more deeply, but I just want to point out one thing about Joe Biden. Like, if there's anything he's run on, it's his capacity for human empathy and his ability to understand struggle and grief and family responsibility. And like, I actually kind of feel like Joe Biden is like uniquely well built to engage in clemency decision-making, but he's definitely going to need a team. So let's talk about what that team should look like.
But also, to your point, I mean, I think about the way that he's even talked about his own son.
Yeah.
The struggles that he's had with substance use and how that needs to be treated with grace and empathy and from a rehabilitative perspective. And so again, he's really, you're right, he's the perfect person to understand the need to have a system that recognizes that people change and that our decisions, particularly when it comes to clemency, should reflect and honor that change. So yes, he's got to create this clemency unit inside the White House. But that's not all. He also has to appoint someone with a really deep understanding of issues having to do with clemency, and somebody who has deep respect, honestly, from both sides of the aisle. And so one person who would be perfect, for example, is Rachel Barkow. She's a law professor at New York University. She's clerked for Justice Antonin Scalia. And then she spent her career focusing on building a better clemency system. She's worked with advocates to help people apply for clemency. And she's already been Senate confirmed once in 2013 as part of the United States Sentencing Commission. And so, you know, she's somebody who would be perfect. And actually, let's bring up a clip of her talking about clemency right now. And this is a clip from 2015 where she spoke.
The people who need clemency are people who are serving sentences that are excessive. And when we think about who's in prison right now, I don't know what the thought is that enters someone's mind of the prototypical prisoner, but when we're talking about the federal prison population, we're largely talking about people who are in there for drug offenses, you know, and there's another chunk that are in there for firearms and immigration. But, you know, half the federal prisoners are there for drug offenses. And those people are often serving long mandatory minimum sentences that were based on the quantity of drugs involved in the drug trafficking, in the drug trade. So you can have individuals who, they were a low-level person in a drug conspiracy. They sold drugs on the corner. You know, they were a mule who took drugs over the border, and they don't get big profits from those drugs. They get very little, in fact. Sometimes they're selling to support their own habit. And those people are going to be prosecuted based on the overall quantity of drugs in that conspiracy. So they're going to be prosecuted the same way as the kingpin would, because everybody's going to be held accountable for the quantity. And the mandatory minimums don't distinguish among the role someone has in an offense. So we have a lot of people in federal prison who are low-level traffickers. They're low people on that totem pole of the drug trafficking hierarchy that are sentenced with laws that had in mind kingpins. And those people, when they are charged with these mandatory minimums, they're convicted because they did traffic, but then the judge's hands were tied, and there was nothing the judge could do to give a lower sentence because the mandatory minimum kicked in. And they spend decades in prison, and the only hope that those people have is for the president to give them a commutation.
There's so many issues with a system that puts people in prison in ways where even a judge has no ability to give an appropriate sentence where their hands are tied. But I don't want to give the impression that Barkow's perspective here is that only people who are in on drug offenses should be eligible for clemency. I think she mentioned there's like the bucket of people who are eligible for clemency is actually huge and diverse. She's talking about some really obvious examples of excessive sentencing, ways in which we've built a system that throws people's lives away for very minor misconduct and does not even let the judges who are supposed to oversee the process subvert the result. Only clemency can save them. But there's so many other types of convictions, you know, being an accessory to an offense, committing a crime as a child. You know, there's just like so many other types of, you know, people we're talking about here. It's a big pipeline.
Basically, convictions where what's on paper doesn't match the whole story, and sort of what the law says in terms of mandatory minimums doesn't match what's actually appropriate for the person who's in front of us.
What I love about this, Alana, is it's so like there's all of these ways in which the law is like othering and sanitized and like alienating because we use magic language and nobody can understand what's going on. Clemency is about like a human sense of, is this really unfair? Like, should we let this person go because it's gross that they're in custody? Are they elderly, sick, safer at home? People need them. This offense was a long time ago. They committed it as a child. It wasn't really that bad. We don't care about marijuana anymore. Like, there's so many different reasons. And it's so human.
And there are so many aspects of the law that, to be honest, aren't all that human, but it's wonderful that we have this one mechanism that, just like you said, it really recognizes the humanity in people that often our legal system just doesn't. But back to Rachel Barkow. She is basically to clemency what Elizabeth Warren is to consumer financial protection. So appointing someone like her to lead a robust White House commutations unit would mean that so many people, thousands of people like Marie Neba, would not be forced to plead to deaf ears. It would mean that presidential pardons could actually meet this intended goal of recognizing the humanity of people. It could go to curing injustice, not to whatever rich white man has enough influence to sway the president. And it would give thousands of families and thousands of communities and loved ones a second chance at freedom. And it would mean that the guidance of public health experts who have been recommending release of people who are medically vulnerable, elderly, would actually be taken into account, and that people would be let out so that they could shelter in place at home instead of suffering and dying from COVID while incarcerated.
Yeah. Okay, so just to sum up, because clemency is a wonky topic, and now if you watch this, you know all about it. Just to sum up, the clemency power lets a president, especially a president with like superhuman empathy like Joe Biden, use their human evaluation of whether people have served enough time and whether they would be better off home with their families to set them free. President Obama and President Trump, well, President Obama was not great at this. President Trump was abysmal at this. But Biden is starting clean and has this chance now in the new year to create a commutations unit with someone widely respected like Rachel Barkow that could really transform the lives of thousands and thousands of people.
And this commutations unit could ensure that thousands of requests for clemency are heard, could expedite releases of thousands of people who are incarcerated on overly long sentences, who pose no threat to public safety, yet are at risk of dying from COVID while incarcerated. And if we had these sorts of systems in place, again, people like Marie Neba might still be alive. The pandemic might be slowed, and thousands of families could avoid needless suffering because of failed federal clemency policy. And if you are thinking, viewers, of an issue to prioritize when calling for Biden to take presidential action, this one doesn't need any kind of Senate approval. Doesn't even need those 2 Georgia wins, which those are big.
It's always nice to think about stuff we can do without needing to win any more seats or any more elections, just stuff we can do on day one. So that's all the time we have today. Thank you so much for joining us on The Appeal Live. I'm Emily Galvan-Almanza. This is Alana Sivan. We are going to be back again on Tuesday to talk about Mayor Eric Garcetti's failures in Los Angeles. You can follow The Appeal News on Facebook, The Appeal on Twitter for the latest news. Thank you so much for joining us.